is time we confronted one of the deepest questions facing modern Australia. What happens to a society when hatred no longer lives only at the fringes, but enters its institutions, its campuses, its media ecosystems, and its public culture? Because for much of Australia's history, anti-Semitism was something many believed happened elsewhere, in Europe, in history books, in darker times. And yet we know, over the past 2.5 years, something has shifted. Jewish Australians describe being intimidated at universities, isolated in workplaces, deplatformed in cultural spaces, targeted online, attacked in the streets, and increasingly forced to defend not merely political positions, but their very legitimacy as Jews in Australian public life. And now, after the Bondi terror attack, where Jewish Australians were specifically targeted by Islamist extremists because they were Jewish, the question confronting Australia has become unavoidable. Is this merely a series of isolated incidents? Or is it something deeper happening to the social fabric of the nation itself? For the first time in our history, and indeed for the first time in the world, Australia, by example, has turned the microscope onto itself through the Royal Commission into Antisemitism and Social Cohesion. Not just to examine acts of hatred, but to examine systems, institutions, ideologies, narratives, and perhaps most importantly, the failure of many Australians to understand what anti-Semitism now looks like in the modern age. My guest on this episode is Peter Wertheim, AM, co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, one of the central figures giving evidence and helping shape the national conversation unfolding inside the Royal Commission itself. And listeners, what he describes is remarkable. A process that has become, in his words, both cathartic and confronting. Testimony so emotionally powerful, it has shocked, well, even seasoned observers. Witnesses reliving trauma in public, questions about Jewish identity, Zionism, collective guilt, social exclusion, media narratives, algorithmic radicalization, Islamist extremism, the anti-Israel far left, security and institutional accountability, and the increasingly blurred line between political activism and anti-Semitic dehumanization. But underneath all of it lies an even bigger question. Can Australia still hold together as a pluralist democracy in an age of tribal politics? Can disagreement remain democratic without becoming dehumanizing? And does the country truly understand what Jewish Australians are trying to say about fear, belonging, peoplehood, identity, the ancient patterns that we believe are re-emerging in modern form? In this challenging and remarkable episode, we go inside the Royal Commission itself. So Peter Wertheim, a co-CEO, co-Chief Executive Officer of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and Gareth Narunsky, editor of the Jewish News. Welcome to Behind the Headlines, gentlemen. Our topic for conversation is the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion. And Peter, you've been giving evidence and, of course, have been following it in quite a lot of detail. So let me start with a broad brush. Peter, what is your overall assessment of how the Royal Commission is proceeding so far?
I don't think it could have gone any better than it has so far. The number of submissions received have exceeded all expectations. The willingness of individuals to come forward to give oral evidence has been incredibly impressive. Some of them are taking a bit of a risk in terms of their job security, their safety, their well-being, and yet have come forward without being identified. Others have come forward and have been identified, and I think in each case have given really searing testimony about their experiences, particularly over the last 2.5 years, how it's affected them personally, how it's affected their relationship with the community as a whole, how the community as a whole has been reacting. All of those things are quite remarkable. And when you think about it, we are thinking about what Jewish life in Australia is like now, how it has deteriorated over the last 2.5 years, what our future is in this country, all of those questions that were never seriously on the table previously. And yet you also need to understand that Australia is the only country in the world that has had the courage to put itself under a microscope and examine the seriousness of anti-Semitism as a problem within Australian society. No other country has done that. Anti-Semitism is a shameful thing. No matter what our opponents and our enemies have tried to do to destigmatize anti-Semitism, it still remains a shameful thing. And for that reason, most societies are not prepared to subject themselves to self-scrutiny about the extent of anti-Semitism in their own ranks. Australia has done that. I think it's commendable that it has done that, and the evidence that has come out has been, I think, in some ways cathartic for the Jewish community and also an eye-opener for the non-Jewish community in Australia and overseas. I think we've had a lot of interest in what's been going on from overseas as well as locally.
So I want to come back to the seriousness of the moment for the community and that cathartic process that we seem to be undergoing. But the first question and the most important one is, how have these accounts landed with inside the actual commission room itself? How do you sense the way the commissioners and council are receiving it?
Yeah, it's very interesting. You perceive certain things watching it on video. You perceive even more when you're there in person, giving evidence or watching other people give evidence. And I had that. I've had both experiences. My overall impression is that the entire team of council assisting the Royal Commission have been incredibly insightful and empathetic towards the witnesses. They have very skillfully drawn out their stories and highlighted the parts that needed to be highlighted for the benefit of educating both the Royal Commission itself and the wider community. And I'm particularly impressed also with the Commissioner herself. She is not only, as I said right at the beginning, a person who is an eminent lawyer and a person of impeccable integrity. I have experienced firsthand just how empathetic she is, how understanding she is. It's not just a matter of high intelligence, but high emotional intelligence that she has displayed throughout the proceeding. And I want to acknowledge that, and I think the community should also acknowledge it.
I think that's very important. And my question is, can you give us an example where, because the question is both ways, shock. Like, how much has the commission been shocked at what they're hearing? But I'm hearing from you that not a shock, but that sense of emotional intelligence that the commissioner has provided. Can you give me an example of where you thought, wow, that was pretty something? And then flip it around to, where have they been shocked at what they've been hearing?
Well, I can't speak for the commission, obviously. The commission will come up with its own report and its own conclusions, and they'll express their own impressions and an understanding of the evidence that's come before them. But there have been many occasions when I've been touched by the manner in which the commissioner and council assisting, and by council assisting I mean the entire team of lawyers, in that office have dealt with witnesses. On the very first day, the commissioner referred to one of the witnesses who was a Holocaust survivor by saying, "We have the honour to have with us a Holocaust survivor." I mean, it's a small thing, but really telling, in my view, about the level of sensitivity of the commissioner to the challenges that people who have undergone trauma face when they have to talk about that trauma. When you talk about it, you're reliving it. And, when I was growing up, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who will tell you this, my parents hardly ever spoke about the Holocaust or the Nazi period. Partly, I think it was to protect me as a child from all that horror, but I think also partly to protect themselves against being re-traumatized by reliving the experience in the retelling. And the commissioner clearly understood that. And then you had the opening statements by counsel assisting and also by Zeli Higa, who is another one of the senior lawyers assisting the commission in the counsel assisting's legal team. A very powerful opening speech, I thought. Very powerful opening address that displayed immense intellectual insight and emotional empathy to the subject matter. I would encourage anyone to go onto the Royal Commission website and just, if you haven't already seen it, just watch it.
It sounds, Peter, from what you're describing, that the Commission has been genuinely impressive and reassured you that the process has been uncovering the truths that Australia had been reluctant to confront. I get that sense of that for you. If I come back to the Jewish community, has it met the seriousness of the moment that we have felt after October 7th and the wave of anti-Semitism that has followed?
I think so. I think that the Commission cannot be faulted in the seriousness of purpose that it has demonstrated in looking at the issues both intellectually but also with emotional understanding and due regard to the sensitivities and difficulties faced by witnesses.
Has there been any time where you feel the Commission has struggled or you found a roadblock inside the Commission? And I want to extend that to political caution or institutional defensiveness or fear of a community backlash or, has there been anything in the way of this openness that you've so well described?
No, in fact, I would say the evidence that I have or my own perception actually reinforces that this commission has an open mind and is approaching this with an open mind. There was a telling moment when I gave evidence right at the very end. The commissioner asked me, what is the basis of the sense of attachment of Australian Jews to Israel? I mean, I'm paraphrasing the question, but it was along those lines. And then she said, is it because Israel is seen as a safe sanctuary if things go wrong? Is that the basis of it? And it was a great opportunity, really, to present to the Commission, but also to the Australian public, the deeper truth about the source of connection that Australian Jews and all Jews feel to Israel. And I was able to say to the Commissioner that what she said is part of the picture, but it's only a small part of the picture, that the sense of connection really runs much deeper. And that depth of connection is because of the historical connections that Jews generally have, with not just with our religion, but with our peoplehood. I mean, this is where the land of Israel is where the Jewish people became a people. It's where the Hebrew language originated. It's also, of course, the place where the Jewish religion developed. But it was also a source of Jewish civilization in a broader sense. And so I was able to explain all those things. And I also was able to say that it's for that reason that when other places in the world were offered to the Jewish people prior to the establishment of the State of Israel as a potential sanctuary, And I was alluding to the so-called Uganda plan and all those sort of things. I said the Jewish people rejected those proposals outright because these places held no connection in any emotional, spiritual, or other sense to the Jewish people, whereas Israel does. So this was an ideal opportunity that the commissioner provided to explain all that, not only to her, but to the broader Australian public. And I think it was a very important moment because it showed, I think, that the commissioner, for all her insight and wisdom, had missed that point. And it was an opportunity to put it before her.
Can I ask, Peter, I got a sense watching last week's hearings versus the previous weeks that the commissioner and the counsel assistings were probing witnesses a little bit more than the previous week. Did you get a sense that they were a bit more challenging those witnesses a little bit more? And what do you think what that was all about?
Yes, I think your perception is correct. But it wasn't the timing, it was the type of witnesses that we're talking about. So in the first week, we had witnesses who were just talking about their lived experiences, and there was very little about that was really capable of being challenged without impugning the honesty and the integrity of the witnesses, and there was no reason to do that. Yeah. In the second week, there were also some witnesses who were giving their lived experience, and again, they were treated in the same way. But on top of that, there were expert witnesses who were giving evidence about the nature of contemporary anti-Semitism and what they understand contemporary anti-Semitism to be. This isn't lived experience. This is expert evidence. And we had Andrew Marcus, we had Andre Oboler, we had Dave Rich, and Dave Rich did a wonderful job, by the way, as we all expected he would.
That was a grueling marathon of the session, that one.
Well, it was because he and I think it was Andrew Marcus who were under cross-examination from certain parts of our, marginal parts of our community who define themselves as anti-Zionists. There's not many of them, but, it is a part of our community. And I think the commissioner was quite right to give them the opportunity to cross-examine those witnesses and put certain things to them. My own impression was that the cross-examiner didn't lay a glove on any of them, but that's my view. The commission will come to its own view.
The ABC reported that cross-examination, and they reported on radio, as I try not to listen to the news segments of the ABC, but it reported a very small piece of this large element that Dave had been giving, and I know Charles Small has been giving, and it just pointed out this one antagonistic piece. Aren't you upset that 21,000 children died? And it was so out of context. It was so wrong in the terms of the whole of that conversation. So my question now is, does the commission, because I know there's been submissions on the ABC, I've put one in myself, one case study of how journalism has become activism. Has that part of the conversation been had in the commission yet around the role of the ABC in fomenting, fostering, provoking, supporting, whatever the right language set is there, for the wide-scale anti-Semitism we're experiencing?
That part of the conversation has not seriously been had as yet. That's my take on it. It may happen not in the next block of hearings, which I think will be dedicated to the question of security, but perhaps in the block of sessions after that. And it is a serious issue. The ABC has been a constant source of complaint from the community about a range of things. Biased reporting is the most common complaint. Occasionally, it has come down to anti-Semitism. I'm not saying every complaint that has been lodged to the ABC about its news and current affairs coverage has been about anti-Semitism. That's far from the case. But occasionally it has come to that as well. And the question that you are referring to is actually a classic illustration of one of the most poisonous and toxic underlying themes of all forms of anti-Semitism throughout history, and that is the attribution of collective guilt to the Jewish community, taking a narrative about one particular incident or a series of incidents.
A false narrative about a series of statistics that are out of context, of no veracity, and then are put in as, the foundation of a series of emotional responses, which we know that's what it does, right?
Well, it is always a collective guilt built on a foundation of falsehood, as it has turned out. I mean, it took how many centuries before the churches repudiated the deicide charge, all right? It's a falsehood because, whatever you might have said, nobody really knows what happened 2,000 years ago, but whatever it was, you can't justify the persecution of Jewish people in the 21st or 20th century on the basis of that. It's just a nonsense. And then, the whole rationale of the Nazis for persecuting Jews as subhumans, again, shown to be pseudoscientific rubbish, a foundation of falsehood for collective stigmatization. And now today we have the genocide charge. It's the same thing. Now, even if one day, and I think this is highly unlikely, but even if one day any particular Israeli politician or military leader is found guilty of genocide, how on earth is that justification for attributing the stigma of collective guilt to the Jewish people as a whole? A 10-year-old girl who got shot in Bondi. How on earth can you justify that on that basis? Because questions of guilt or innocence are about individuals.
The question is the Royal Commission understanding that no other ethnic community in this country is being vilified and hated for the actions of another country. Do they get that? Because
I think the Commission gets that, but it's even more complicated than that, because Jewish people in Australia shouldn't be put in a position where they are required publicly to denounce the very existence of the state of Israel as the price they have to pay for being spared anti-Semitism and persecution. All right?
Yeah.
You cannot justify racial vilification, let alone racially based violence, on the strength of that.
You can't at all. So my question is, was that cross-examination, from your perspective, how did it land? Did it clarify the debate? Did it muddy things? Or did it reveal something deeper about those who are antagonistic? How did it land is the real question.
Well, personally, I thought it fell flat,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll find out when the Commission comes down with its report, because the impression that it made on me and other people in the Jewish community is really beside the point. I mean,
no, of course.
Ultimately, what will matter is the way it was perceived by the Commission. And I'm sure the Commission will be perfectly capable of giving expression to its views about that when it comes out with its final report.
I thought, for one, that the lawyer representing the Jewish Council came across very condescending and aggressive.
Yeah. Well,
it doesn't mean, although, condescending and aggression in style doesn't mean it doesn't make the point. And my question is, did it land? Did it make a point? And I understand from our perspective, it's like it's obscurantist, picking at narratives, not facts, at outrage, not reality, and understand all that. The question is, how important was it in the scheme of the Commission? That's all.
Yeah. I mean, I think what Gareth said is right about the manner, but in terms of the substance, I really thought it fell flat. Yeah. Whether the Commission sees it the same way, we'll find out in due course.
So Peter, do you think, has the Commission changed the way anti-Semitism is being understood publicly? And by that, I mean, has it shifted our conversation from Australia's conversation from isolated incidents towards an understanding that something more systemic and cultural has taken place over the last 2 years?
Well, I hope it's the latter. Again, we'll find out when the final report comes down. But there's something else that really struck me about this, and that is, over the recent years, we've made great effort to try to educate the broader community about what anti-Semitism is. And often that conversation devolves into a discussion about who and what the Jewish people are, because that's got to be your starting point. And it just seems to me that although we've done quite a good job specifically with Holocaust education, when it comes to broader education about what is or is not anti-Semitic and what falls over the line and what doesn't, I don't think we've done a very good job at all. I think when I've looked at some of the educational programs that have been put out and some of the efforts that have been made by well-meaning people and people with a lot of knowledge, it always strikes me as though they are pitched on the basis that we're talking to our own community and that everyone will understand what we're talking about when we say X, Y, and Z. And what's become really obvious to me is that you've got highly intelligent people in the commission itself for whom you cannot make that assumption because it's not part of their lived experience as it is part of ours. And so it seems to me we have to go and rethink the content of our anti-Semitism education programs from the beginning and ask ourselves the question, what is it that non-Jews don't get about the Jewish people and about anti-Semitism? What is confusing them? And try to refashion our education programs on the basis of their understanding, not on the basis of ours.
So let me ask you both. Peter, in the seat you're in, Gareth, editor of the Jewish News, the seat you're in, what is it that Australia, non-Jewish Australia, ordinary Australia doesn't get? What is it? What's missing? We all thought we're just another minority. We have a particular way. You know, we have our own faith sector, but essentially we're Australians and everything is hunky-dory. What is it that's missing? Peter? Gareth?
Well, I'm happy to give Gareth a go too, but I think the first thing that's missing is how can Jews be both a nation, ethnic community on the one hand, and a religion on the other hand? I mean, who else is like that? I mean, in the modern mind, religion's one thing. You know, if you're a Catholic, you're a Catholic, but if your ethnicity is something else. So if you're Irish, that's your ethnicity. If you're Greek, that's your ethnicity. But your religion is something different. Now, for us, religion, ethnicity, language, and culture, they're all wrapped up in the one holistic identity because that was the way human identity was conceived in ancient times and for most of human history. And we're a 3,000-year-old people, and so we conceive of our identity in that holistic way. It's different from the way modern society conceives of identity in a sort of compartmentalized way. So that's the first thing we have to explain to people. And then, you know, they then begin to understand why it is, you know, in their minds, what they have always thought of as a purely religious community can have the right to have its own nation, its own state. Because that's something many of them just don't get. So that's a legitimate question. It has a clear answer, and we need to provide the answer and to make it explicit to address that question. It might seem obvious to us, but it's not obvious to other people.
Clearly not. Gareth, anything to add?
Look, I think Peter's answered that question better than I could. And I can speak from personal experience, speaking to non-Jewish people who are not anti-Semitic, just non-Jewish people who I know who don't get the fact that to be Jewish is not just religion. It's so much more. It's culture, it's peoplehood, it's belonging. And like Peter said, in their experience, if they're Catholic or Muslim or whatever they are, it's a religion. And everything else is a separate part of their identity, and they don't get that part with us. More broader, when you said, Adam, what do people don't get about Jews? I mean, if we solve that problem, we solve anti-Semitism. So, you know, we've got to keep chipping away and working at it.
Partly, but then we've got to work on all the negatives. And I don't want to go down that road in this particular conversation, but I do want to talk about that issue. And the question links to this one around what the commissioner asked Jeremy Liebler about criticism of Israel. Many people, you know, and I hear it in the Labor Party endlessly, you know, Adam, we're not anti-Semitic, we're criticizing Israel. And my answer to that is, of course, go for it. I've actually been in more demonstrations in Israel criticizing the government than you've ever been, right? but I don't deny its existence, and I don't call for its eradication, and I don't call for a murder of its people. And it seems to me an easy bow to draw, but the Commissioner asked Jeremy about this in specific terms, and I know others too, around where does criticism of Israel fall into anti-Semitism. My question is, I don't want to relitigate that. Do you think that the Commission gets that now, that there are boundaries, lines where criticism is one thing, but vilification, demonization is another? Is that now cleared up in the eyes of the Commission? That's the important question.
Well, my take on it is that they're still struggling with that. They do understand the difference between a critique of the policies of the Israeli government of the day or of the actions of the IDF on the one hand and denying Israel's right of existence on the other. I mean, those are two polarities, if you like. But in between, there's a lot of grey area.
Yeah.
And I think they're still grappling with that, as many other people are. So where do they draw the line? What is the test? And I think this is where the peoplehood point is so critical, because once the peoplehood of the Jewish people, it's a tautology really, but once that's established and understood, and Zionism is explained as the right of self-determination of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, the historic homeland, the corollary of that should be easier to delineate, and that is one species of anti-Semitism is the denial of what is considered a universal right of peoples, namely the right of self-determination in their respective homelands, just to the Jewish people, to single out the Jewish people as the one people who do not deserve that universal right. If you accept that as being discriminatory and therefore racist, that seems to me where you draw the line. Now, I understand that there'll be other people with different views, but to me, that's always been the test.
So the grey area is still the Commission is going to work through. I'm hearing that it's not so clear cut. There's a lot in that. There's a lot in that.
Can I just further to that one? If you want to look at where anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism, where that line is, I mean, IRA, for mine, provides a fairly decent explanation of that. And IRA, Commissioner Virginia Bell, has, to my congratulations, endorsed IRA and said that's the definition that the Commission is going to use. So is there a way, I guess, gently remind the Commission, if you want to know where the line is, just read IRA, it's all there.
And just to be clear, IRA means the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition that essentially says that criticism of Israel is not per se anti-Semitism. It's demonization or eradication that is demonization and is therefore anti-Semitism. So it's not about shutting down that debate. But I'm hearing from Peter that it's not 100% clear yet.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is that IRA itself is not and does not pitch itself as a legally binding definition. It is, and this is often overlooked, it is a working definition. Why do they use the word working definition? Because it is not an exhaustive definition and is not intended to be. It has illustrative examples as a guide to educating people about what anti-Semitism can look like and the different forms it can take. But it's not definitive. And so simply to refer to IRA doesn't completely solve the problem. It's a good guide. And of course, we've endorsed it, and most Jewish organizations have endorsed it as the starting point. But it is a starting point. That's why it's a working definition. It's not the kind of the end point as well. And that's why these questions do arise. And of course, the Commissioner didn't just take it on herself to adopt the IRA working definition as the guide for the Commission. This was baked into the terms of reference from the outset. And it was very important, I think, that it should have been. That's not to say that the Commissioner won't entertain points of view that put forward critiques of IRA or alternative definitions. I think the barrister who cross-examined Dave Rich, for example, put forward the Jerusalem Declaration, and so on. As I said, I don't think that was put forward in a way that will have any lasting impact with the Commission, but that remains to be seen. That's just my own personal take on it.
Peter, has anything during the exchanges in the Commission surprised you? And I mean that from a number of levels, intellectually, strategically, emotionally. You've described the emotional intelligence that you've described up front as something, I'm going to describe it as a surprise, but that empathy that has been exhibited. Is there anything else that surprised you in the course of the Commission?
Well, that emotional intelligence and empathy was a pleasant surprise. Let me emphasise that. I can't say there's anything else that has surprised me other than the depth of suffering that has emerged from the testimony. I mean, if you listen to individual testimonies, there's nothing in any one of them that is any different to what the ECAJ and I'm sure other Jewish organisations have encountered from people who have contacted us from within our community over the last 2.5 years. But taken collectively, and at times, looking at the emotional depth of the narratives that have been put forward, they've shocked me. They haven't surprised me, but they've shocked me because of the extent of the suffering that they have revealed, which, taken collectively, is far, far bigger than the sum of its individual parts.
It's been very painful. It's been a very, very painful experience. Do you think enough attention has been paid to two things? And I want to ask them separately. The first one is the role of Islamic extremism and the role of how Islamism in Australian society has promoted anti-Semitism. That's the first one. Has enough attention been paid to that?
I think that's a subjective question. Certainly, there has been a lot in the written submissions that has addressed that particular problem, including in my own submission. There's also a lot on the record. Last year's...
Peter, it's an objective question because the people who shot 55 people at Bondi were Islamic extremists, members of violent classes. So it's not a subjective question in that sense. Has the Commission, is the Commission dealing with it?
Well, the Commission is limited by one very powerful restriction, and that is it cannot prejudge any of the factual issues that are likely to emerge in the upcoming trial of Naveed Akram. Okay?
Sure.
And
that doesn't mean it doesn't deal with the issues surrounding it.
That doesn't mean it can't deal with the issue of Islamist extremism and Islamist anti-Semitism as a social problem. It can deal with that.
So has enough attention been paid to that?
In the submissions, yes. In the hearings so far, no. I think that'd be my broad summary of it. When you think more deeply about it, whilst the violent attacks that have taken place on Jewish institutions have been associated with either the Islamist extremists of the Islamic Republic of Iran or ISIS or other groups, the broader social problem of the marginalisation, cancellation and exclusion of Jews from full participation in various parts of Australia's public life is actually coming not from Islamism, it's coming from the anti-Israel left, the extreme anti-Israel left. And so to the extent that the Royal Commission is charged with the responsibility of looking at anti-Semitism emanating from institutions and society, it is obliged to look at that problem too, which is coming from a different source. So the violence that the community has faced is another question.
Yes, there's violence that we face, but and the testimony is there. So the next question is, do you think the Commission has paid enough attention to far left anti-Israelism that has spilled into anti-Semitism via the process of deplatforming or vilification or cancellation? Debbie Conway, that is it. Just relive that. And I want to then go on to universities. My story with my son. Has enough attention been paid to the role of the cultural class and the academic class and the media class in promoting this narrative of Israel as evil and therefore spilling over into anti-Semitism. Is there enough attention to this, Peter?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of attention paid to the problem because of all the personal testimony that's been given. A lot of the lived experience related precisely to that. It's not just Deborah Conway and other people in the arts and culture sector who've spoken about this, but young students at school, university students. I mean, all of that testimony has come out and been dealt with in the first block of hearings. But the institutional responses to that has yet to come under scrutiny. And that seems to me to be something that will be dealt with perhaps in the third block of hearings down the track.
Okay.
After they deal with the security issues.
Right. So just to give our listeners the sequence.
First block has been both lived experience and expert evidence about anti-Semitism. That's the first block of sessions that have been held. The second block will deal, as I understand it, with security issues, and some of that may necessarily be dealt with in camera because it's confidential and sensitive. The third block, as I understand it, will look at institutional responses, and that will, I think universities will be front and center there, but not just universities. We have enormous problems with anti-Semitism also in the healthcare sector, the arts and culture sector, which we've already touched on, and in other parts of society. So the media, social media, sport. There's plenty of other fields to explore.
Yeah. So my question was going to be, has enough attention so far been put on the role of social media and what I call algorithmic radicalization, which is not an institutional issue, but it's more a structural issue? Because what we're feeling, an industrial scale ecosystem of incitement, Peter. I mean,
Yes.
it's not too strong a word to describe that.
Yeah, and some of it has been state orchestrated. We know that.
And
Yeah.
has enough attention been paid on that yet? Or do you think that will come out in the institutional response?
Well, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the submissions have addressed that. It hasn't yet come out in the hearings. I think that will be probably in the third block. Again, the commission will decide how it runs its hearings, but that's my understanding.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I've got two very different questions. One is, obviously, we saw in the first block, Jewish Council had their barrister doing some cross-examining. I understand that the mainstream community organizations who are all working together have also been given leave to do some cross-examining using ABL. When is that likely? In what block do you think is that likely to happen? That's my first question. The other question is completely separate, which is, obviously, anti-Semitism carries on despite the Royal Commission, and even indeed online anti-Semitic commentary about the Royal Commission. And I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, you're right. The organizations, the main organizations in the Jewish community who are represented by ABL have barristers instructed to represent us. They have been granted leave to appear throughout the proceedings. Unlike the barrister representing the Jewish Council of Australia, who was given leave to appear just at the first session for the purposes of cross-examining a couple of the experts. So when will the barristers representing the mainstream community start cross-examining witnesses? I suspect that will happen in the second and third block of sessions. Again, I don't want to preempt any decisions that still have to be made about strategy and tactics and all the rest of it, but in broad terms, that would be what I would anticipate.
Yeah. And the second question about your read on anti-Semitic commentary, particularly online, about the commission itself.
Well, I'm sure the commission is well aware of it because they have, people monitoring the media as well. And of course, there was also somebody who attended outside the commission wearing an anti-Semitic T-shirt who has since been charged. And I'm sure the commission would have been aware of that as well. And there's a lot of, as you say, online commentary, particularly on social media. What the commission makes of that, we'll find out in the final report, I suppose. But quite apart from that, social media and other online commentary about the Royal Commission itself, I suspect that the whole sector, the whole online sector, will come under scrutiny at some stage. And I mean, the Royal Commission really is an opportunity to call those sectors to account, because the Royal Commission has extensive powers. It can serve notices to produce on organisations. It can require them to answer questions that are asked of it. The ECAJ itself has had 3 notices to produce and been asked an extensive series of questions, which required hundreds of hours of work, but which we fully complied with and were happy to do. And we were happy to do so because we're anxious for this information to be put before the Royal Commission. But that also, I mean, those powers also apply to witnesses who perhaps will have a different interest and will be less inclined to be cooperative with the Commission. But if they refuse to cooperate, they could be held in contempt of the Royal Commission, and that carries very serious penalties. So again,
So
it'll be interesting to see how the Royal Commission exercises those powers.
let's say Facebook, right? Because it's this, or X, sewers. They can be sewers. They're maybe, they're headquartered in America, they're whatever it is, however they're structured. But they're not present in Australia. They may have a couple of people here, but
No, they have an office here, quite an extensive office, and they have an Australian arm. And I'm not sure.
They'd be compelled by the Commission under the powers to.
They are within the jurisdiction. They have had dealings with the Jewish community, including the ECAJ, over the years. They can be compelled to produce documents. They can be compelled to answer questions.
Right.
But of course, it's entirely within the discretion of the Commission itself as to how those powers are used, if at all.
Yeah. So, looking ahead now, knowing that institutional responses are yet to come and security is yet to come, and we've all talked a lot about that previously. Looking ahead down the track, what outcomes from the Commission would for you constitute genuine success, Peter?
I'll be looking for cultural change in different sectors of Australian society. Universities, one of them, but not the only one, of course.
Yeah.
We're looking for cultural change, a better understanding of what anti-Semitism is, how it manifests, and the necessity of avoiding it, and the necessity of taking measures to prevent it. I think if we can achieve that level of cultural change, it will have been a momentous victory for the community. I don't think anti-Semitism is going to go away. I don't think anti-Semitism has ever gone away. But if we can roll back the tide and push anti-Semitism back into the margins where it emerged and make it once more unacceptable in the mainstream, I think that will be the test. If anti-Semitism continues in the mainstream in any systematic way, as it has over the last 2.5 years, then I think it will be a very sad day, not just for the Jewish community, but for the whole country.
So, after everything you've heard, testimonies, the hostility, the pain, but also the solidarity, not just of the Jewish community, but many in the Australian community who stand with us, are you more optimistic or more worried about the future of Jewish life in Australia than you were a year ago?
Both.
What a Jewish answer.
Well, yeah, it comes with the territory. No, look, I'm optimistic because Australia has actually had the guts to put the microscope on itself, and it has done so because of a grassroots public clamour
To look at it.
the underlying causes of what happened at Bondi last year.
Yeah.
Okay, that gives me hope. The other thing that gives me hope is the outpouring of support, expressions of support that the ECAJ gets, and I'm sure other organisations too, from Australians of all different backgrounds. They leave us messages via our website or by direct email or in other ways, and it just comes in waves. I mean, every time there's been some atrocious thing happen to the Jewish community, whether it was the Opera House steps incident in 2023, the Adass synagogue fire, the Bondi shootings, and a whole lot of other things. I mean, there's been an outpouring of support. On the other hand, there's also been a smattering of people who contact us saying, well, what do you expect? You deserve it. And, all the other usual anti-Semitic tropes that are so familiar to us and have so many echoes in our history. So, that gives me pause as well. My optimism is not unbridled. On the other hand, I haven't personally made any arrangements to emigrate, to make aliyah or emigrate elsewhere. And maybe I'm living in a fool's paradise, but I haven't done that. I know that many other Australian Jews have done so, and I make no criticism of them for doing so. Everyone has to make their own personal assessment of where they stand and their own take on the security of the Jewish community going forward. My own view is to be realistic, but not to panic.
I've got one last question. When the Prime Minister in January announced that, yes, we'll have the Royal Commission and the plan is for it to hand down its report around the time of the anniversary of Bondi, people were wondering, is that enough time? Having now had a taste of the first hearing block and how it's kind of operating, what is your reading of that time frame and whether it will be able to really get into that nitty-gritty?
Well, we were always of the view that it was going to be a challenge to do it in 1 year because most Royal Commissions go for much longer. But the Commissioner from the outset expressed a determination to get the thing done in that time. I wonder whether there's enough time to do what I referred to earlier, and that is to compel the production of evidence and the answers to questions from different segments of society, different sectors of society and the institutions within them. This is not generally a quick process, particularly if there is resistance, as I expect there would be, from those quarters. So is that enough? Have we allowed enough time for this to happen by the end of the year? I think it's an immense challenge, personally, but ultimately this is going to be the Commissioner's call.
So is the Commissioner empowered to extend or in other ways lengthen the process, even if it's not under a commission structure, if she feels that the answers aren't complete?
No, the Commissioner can only request the government to extend the term of the Royal Commission. She cannot unilaterally extend it herself.
Okay. Peter Wertheim, co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, thank you very much for your time in updating us on how the Royal Commission into Antisemitism and Social Cohesion has been progressing. Gareth Narunsky, editor of the Jewish News, thank you for your time. Peter, we might come back to you after the fourth block and check in again
Hello.
on how you think those two very particularly challenging aspects around security and institutional accountability are. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Gareth.
Thank you both. Thank you.